Her name meant light, yet to protect her faith from the obsession of a vengeful man, St. Lucy willingly stepped into darkness. The cruel paradox of her life is this: the girl who lost her eyes became one of Christianity's brightest symbols. Lucy's beauty made her a target, her devotion made her dangerous, and her refusal to marry unleashed a betrayal that sealed her fate. Whether her eyes were torn out by Roman soldiers or offered up by her own hand, her martyrdom became a story written in blood rather than vision. This is the true story of St. Lucy, the young woman who chose blindness over surrender, purity over survival, and whose mutilated eyes became the most radiant emblem of faith in early Christian history. But while she was named for the light, her true history was forged in the terrifying shadows of the Great Persecution. The eyes on the plate are not merely a symbol, they are the brutal remnants of a conflict between imperial law and personal faith. It is a story that has been softened by time and sanitized by religious tradition, turned into a gentle fable for children in white dresses wearing crowns of candles. But the reality of Syracuse in the year 304 AD was not a fable. It was a city where piety could be a death sentence. The path from teenage girl to patron saint was not paved with fables, but with blood. Behind the Renaissance halos lies the grit of the Roman Empire. The Syracuse of Lucia's youth was not a quiet provincial town. It was a sprawling, roaring metropolis of the Mediterranean, a jewel of the Roman province of Sicily. It was a city of blinding white limestone basking under a relentless sun, a place of immense wealth and crushing poverty existing side by side. The air would have smelled of the salt spray from the Ionian Sea, the heavy perfume of olive presses, and the stench of the slave markets where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. It was a world dominated by the physical. The Romans worshipped the body, they worshipped power, and they worshipped the visible might of the emperor. In this world, a young woman like Lucia was a commodity. Born into a wealthy, noble family, she was not truly a person in the eyes of the law. She was an asset. Her value lay in her lineage, her dowry, and, most fatally, her legendary beauty. Historical accounts, though often fragmented, agree on one specific detail that would become the catalyst for her destruction: her eyes. They were described not just as beautiful, but as captivating, possessed of a brightness that men found unsettling and irresistible. In a society where women were expected to be demure and invisible until summoned, Lucia's eyes commanded attention. They were the light that her name promised. But in a time of darkness, a bright light does not just illuminate, it attracts predators. Lucia grew up in the shadow of the Great Persecution. This was not a time of casual discrimination against Christians. It was a systematic state-sponsored campaign of extermination. Emperor Diocletian, desperate to unify a fracturing empire, had declared that the old gods were angry. The economic instability, the barbarian incursions at the borders, the internal rot, all of it was blamed on the sect of atheists who refused to burn incense to Jupiter. These atheists were the Christians. Edicts were issued that turned the entire apparatus of the Roman state into a hunting machine. Churches were razed to the ground, scriptures were burned in public squares, and bishops were dragged into arenas to be torn apart by wild beasts for the entertainment of the mob. To be a Christian in Syracuse in 304 AD was to live with a target painted on your back. It was a capital crime, punishable by death, torture, or enslavement. Yet, in the heart of this terror, inside a villa with mosaic floors and frescoed walls, Lucia was living a double life. Outwardly, she was the dutiful daughter of a noble house, draped in the silks appropriate for her station, attending the necessary social functions, and keeping her head down. inwardly she was a radical. She had secretly pledged her life to the forbidden god. She had made a private vow of virginity, a concept that was utterly alien and offensive to the Roman mindset. To the Romans, virginity was useful only insofar as it increased a bride's value. To keep it forever was a waste of a reproductive resource. Lucia's vow was an act of silent rebellion against the entire structure of the empire. She was reclaiming ownership of her own body in a world that claimed to own her. The tragedy of Lucia's life began with the death of her father when she was just a child. His death left her and her mother Eutychia alone in a society that preyed on widows and orphans. Without a male protector, a wealthy estate was vulnerable. Eutychia, a woman of the world who likely did not share the intensity of her daughter's secret faith, sought security in the only way she knew how: a strategic marriage alliance. She began to arrange a betrothal for Lucia. The man chosen for Lucia is never named in the ancient chronicles, but his character is etched in acid across the narrative. He was a young nobleman, a pagan, and a product of his time. He was likely wealthy, connected, and utterly entitled. When he looked at Lucia, he did not see a spiritual equal. He saw a prize. He saw the land that came with her dowry, the prestige of her family name, and obsessively, he saw her physical beauty. The text suggests a fixation that bordered on madness. He was haunted by her eyes. He spoke of them to his friends. He praised them in public. It was not love. It was a hunger for possession. He wanted to own the light. For years, Lucia managed to stall. She was young, and there were always excuses, mourning periods, delays in the legal proceedings, the complexities of estate management. But the walls were closing in. The betrothal was a legal contract, and in Rome, a contract was binding. To break it was to invite social ruin and legal retribution. Lucia was trapped in a slow-motion collision between her vow to God and the iron laws of men. She lived in a state of constant, low-level dread, knowing that eventually the man who stared at her with such hungry intensity would come to claim his property. The breaking point arrived not through the marriage negotiations, but through a crisis of health. Eutychia, Lucia's mother, fell violently ill. The ancient texts describe a flux of blood, a hemorrhagic condition that baffled the physicians of Syracuse. For 4 years, the older woman suffered. They spent fortunes on doctors, on salves, on offerings to the goddess Hygeia, but nothing worked. Eutychia was slowly bleeding to death, her strength fading with each passing month. The looming death of her mother terrified Lucia, not just because of the grief, but because Eutychia was the only buffer standing between Lucia and the inevitable marriage. Once Eutychia was gone, Lucia would be fully under the control of guardians, or forced immediately into the bed of the pagan suitor. In desperation, Lucia proposed a dangerous journey. She convinced her mother to travel to the city of Catania, about 40 miles north of Syracuse. It was a pilgrimage, but it had to be undertaken with the utmost discretion. They were going to the tomb of St. Agatha. Agatha had been martyred only 50 years earlier, during the persecution of Decius. Her story was fresh in the minds of Sicilian Christians. She was a local hero, a young woman who had also resisted a powerful man and had been tortured to death for it. Her tomb was rumored to be a place of miracles. The journey from Syracuse to Catania would have been arduous for a sick woman, traversing the rugged, sun-baked coast of eastern Sicily, with the smoking cone of Mount Etna looming on the horizon like a constant reminder of the volatile earth beneath their feet. When they arrived at the shrine, it was crowded. Even in the midst of persecution, the faithful found ways to gather. Lucia and Eutychia knelt before the tomb during the reading of the gospel. The atmosphere was thick with the murmurs of prayer, and the desperation of the sick seeking healing. It was here, amidst the press of bodies and the suffocating heat, that Lucia fell into a trance. Whether it was exhaustion, spiritual ecstasy, or a divine intervention, the world around her fell away. In the silence of her own mind, she saw Agatha. The martyr appeared not as a corpse broken by torture, but in glory, surrounded by angels, radiant and terrifyingly alive. The vision spoke to her. The words were not comforting platitudes. They were a call to arms. "Lucia, my sister," the vision said, "why do you ask of me what you yourself have the power to give? Your faith has healed your mother." Lucia woke from the trance with a jolt. She turned to Eutychia and found that the bleeding had stopped. The color was returning to her mother's face. It was a miracle, undeniable and immediate. In the emotional flood of that moment, with her mother weeping tears of relief and gratitude, Lucia saw her chance. She seized the opportunity that the miracle had provided. "Mother," Lucia whispered, gripping Eutychia's hands, "if you love me, and if you are grateful for this life you have been given back, grant me one thing. Do not speak to me any more of this earthly husband, the dowry you have saved for my marriage. Give it to me now, so that I may give it to the true bridegroom." Eutychia hesitated. She was a practical woman. To give away a dowry was to destroy the family's financial future. It was social suicide. It meant Lucia would never marry, never have children, never be protected by a man. But she had just been pulled back from the brink of death. The spiritual power of the moment was overwhelming. In a decision that would seal both their fates, Eutychia agreed. They returned to Syracuse changed women. The fear that had paralyzed them was replaced by a frantic, ecstatic energy. They began to liquidate their assets. It was a fire sale of a noble estate. Gold, jewels, tapestries, fine furniture, everything was sold or given directly to the poor. Lucia went into the slums of Syracuse, the dark underbelly of the city where the Roman elite never ventured. She distributed coins to the beggars, food to the starving, and medicine to the sick. For a brief window of time, Lucia must have felt an intoxicating sense of freedom. She was dismantling the cage that had been built for her. By getting rid of her wealth, she was making herself undesirable to a fortune hunter. She was actively destroying her status as a good match. It was a strategic shedding of skin. But in a city like Syracuse, secrets do not keep. The sight of a noblewoman walking through the gutters, handing out silver like it was water, attracted attention. The servants whispered. The neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows, and inevitably, the news reached the ears of the man who was waiting to marry her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was not just rejecting him, she was robbing him. In his mind, that dowry was already his, those jewels, that land, that gold. It was the price of her beauty, and she was casting it into the mud. His composure shattered. In that moment, the veneer of the heartbroken lover evaporated, revealing the cold fury of a tyrant denied his prize. It was the rage of a man who viewed affection only as possession. For a man driven by status, watching his future dissolve was a visceral humiliation. It wasn't just the money, it was the emasculation. In a patriarchal society like Rome, a woman acting with financial independence was a direct assault on male authority. By giving away the dowry, Lucia wasn't just being charitable. She was unilaterally canceling the transaction that defined his worth. He likely stood in the market square, watching the last of the coins disappear into the filthy hands of a leper, and felt a hatred fueled by wounded pride consume him. This is the darkest form of betrayal, the moment love curdles into a desire for annihilation. He realized that she valued the lowest scum of Syracuse more than she valued him. The humiliation was public and total. Every coin she handed to a beggar was a slap in his face. His obsession with her beauty instantly inverted. If he could not have her as a trophy to display, he would make her a carcass to be pitied. The instinct to destroy what he could not control took hold. If I cannot control you, I will destroy the vessel you inhabit. He didn't just want her dead, he wanted her erased. He wanted the state to do what he couldn't, to crush the will that had dared to defy him. To the fiancé, this was not merely rejection, it was theft. Driven by a vindictive rage, he weaponized her own secret against her. If he could not possess her as a wife, he would ensure the law destroyed her as a traitor. He went straight to the governor with a single lethal accusation. She was a Christian. And in 304 AD, that accusation was a weapon more lethal than a gladius. He requested an audience with Paschasius, the governor of Sicily. Paschasius was a man of the state, a bureaucrat charged with enforcing the emperor's will. He had quotas to fill, order to maintain. When the young nobleman arrived, trembling with rage, and pointed a finger at the house of Lucia, Paschasius listened. The accusation was simple: treason. She was refusing the imperial cult. She was funding the underground network of dissidents with her fortune. She was a threat to the stability of Syracuse. The order was given. Soldiers were dispatched. The heavy boots of the legionaries echoed on the cobblestones as they marched toward Lucia's home. The time of hiding was over. The shadows were lifting, and the true horror was about to begin. Lucia, sitting in her home, perhaps still smelling the incense from her prayers, would have heard the knock on the door. It was the sound of the world coming to collect its debt. She had given away her money, but she still had her body, and the empire was coming to take it. The knock on the door was not a polite request. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of wood against wood that signaled the end of privacy and the beginning of state intervention. When the heavy timber gave way, the illusion of Lucia's sanctuary shattered along with the latch. The soldiers who spilled into the atrium were not the ceremonial guards of the city parades. These were the enforcers of the urban cohort, men whose armor was scratched from use and who smelled of sweat, garlic, and the indifference of their profession. They did not see a noblewoman or a future saint. They saw a file number, a problem to be processed, a body to be transported from point A to point B. The violence of the arrest was in its efficiency. There were no screams, only the sharp intake of breath from the servants and the dull thud of boots on the mosaic floor. Lucia did not struggle. To fight them would have been to engage with them on their level, the level of physical force, and she had already moved her mind to a different plane. She allowed herself to be manhandled, her wrists bound with rough hemp that bit into the soft skin of a girl who had never known a day of hard labor. The walk from her villa to the praetorium was a parade of humiliation. Syracuse was a city that lived on the streets, and a spectacle like this drew a crowd instantly. The same neighbors who had once envied her family's wealth now peered out from behind half-closed shutters with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Rumors moved faster than soldiers, and the whisper had already spread. The girl was a Christian, a traitor, a fool who had thrown her fortune into the gutter. As she was dragged through the market square, the jeers began. It was a cacophony of rejection. The very people she had fed days earlier, the beggars and the destitute, were nowhere to be seen, or perhaps they too were shouting, swept up in the mob mentality that demands a scapegoat. The dust of the street coated the hem of her dress, turning the white fabric gray, a visual metaphor for the tarnishing of her reputation. She was not taken immediately to the governor. The Roman judicial system was a machine designed to grind people down before they ever saw a judge. She was thrown into the holding cells beneath the governor's palace. The transition from the blinding Mediterranean sun to the subterranean darkness was physically painful. The air in the dungeon was thick, heavy with the copper tang of old blood, the ammonia of urine, and the damp rot of the sea seeping through the limestone foundations. It was a place designed to induce despair. Here the noblewoman was stripped of her status. She was just meat in the dark. But it was in this darkness that the first true test of her resolve occurred. She was not alone. The cells were crowded with others, thieves, murderers, and other Christians who had been rounded up in the dragnet. The darkness, however, was not her greatest enemy. Her greatest enemy was waiting for her in the light. When the heavy iron grate was finally hauled open and her name was barked out by a jailer, she was dragged up the stone steps into the blinding glare of the courtroom. The praetorium was an imposing structure, designed to make the individual feel small and the state feel eternal. Marble columns soared upward, and at the far end, on a raised dais, sat Paschasius, the governor of Sicily. He was a man worn thin by the burden of administration, his face a mask of bored cruelty. He did not hate Lucia personally. He hated the disorder she represented. To him, she was a logistical error that needed correcting. But standing near the governor, in a position of privileged observation, was the source of the true horror. It was him, the fiancé. The man whose name history has erased but whose obsession drove the machinery of her death. He looked different now. The mask of the courting lover had dropped, revealing the jagged edges of a wounded ego. He stared at her not with love but with a predatory ownership. His eyes traced the lines of her face, lingering on the bruises the soldiers had left, and then fixed with a terrifying intensity on her eyes. Even here in the shadow of the executioner's sword, his obsession remained physical. He whispered something to the governor, pointing at her, his hand trembling with a mixture of rage and desire. The trial began. It was not a trial of evidence, but a trial of will. Paschasius leaned forward, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Lucia of Syracuse," he intoned, the boredom slipping from his voice to be replaced by the sharp edge of authority. "You stand accused of impiety, of funding treasonous cults, and of violating the sanctity of a betrothal contract. How do you plead?" Lucia stood in the center of the room. She was small, dirty, and bound, but she stood with a stillness that unnerved the onlookers. When she spoke, her voice was not the trembling whisper of a frightened girl. It was clear, resonant, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a bell. "I plead guilty to serving the living God," she said. "I plead guilty to despising the idols of stone and wood that you call gods. As for the contract, I have made a better one." The rejected suitor flinched as if struck. Paschasius frowned, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair. He tried the tactic of paternalism. "You are a child," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have been misled by fanatics. Burn a pinch of incense to the emperor. Renounce this madness. Your fiancé is generous. He may still take you back if you purify yourself." It was a trap, and they both knew it. To return to the fiancé now would be a fate worse than death. It would be to become the property of a man who had already tried to kill her. Lucia looked directly at the governor, and then slowly she turned her gaze to the fiancé. Her eyes, those twin pools of light that had started this war, locked onto his. "I will never return to that darkness," she said. "You urge me to preserve my life, but you are asking me to die. You ask me to satisfy the lust of a man who sees me as cattle. I belong to no man." Moments later, his composure shattered. The veneer of civilization cracked, and he lunged forward, abandoning all decorum. "She is a witch," he screamed, his face contorted. "Look at her. She uses those eyes to bewitch men. She cast a spell on me. She promised herself to me, and now she uses her beauty to mock the law. It was a pivotal moment. The accusation shifted from religious treason to something more primal, more dangerous. He was weaponizing her beauty against her. He was telling the court that her very existence, her physical form, was a provocation. He was saying, "Look at what she has. It is too dangerous to be left uncontrolled." Pascasius saw the crowd shifting. The mob loved a story of witchcraft and seduction. He needed to regain control. He ordered the guards to silence the fiancé, but looked at Lucia with a new, colder calculation. "You speak of purity," the governor sneered. "You speak of belonging to a heavenly spouse. But you are here in my court, subject to my laws. If you are so determined to keep your body for your God, perhaps we should see how much your God values it." He paused, letting the threat hang in the stifling air. "If you do not recant," Pascasius said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "I will have you stripped. I will have you dragged to the lupanar, the brothel. I will give you to the crowds. We will see how much of this holy arrogance remains when you have been used by every soldier in the cohort." A gasp went through the courtroom. This was the ultimate violation. For a Roman noblewoman, the brothel was a degradation beyond death. It was the total erasure of identity. Watching the chaos unfold, the fiancé wore a mask of twisted satisfaction. This was his revenge. If he couldn't have her, he would ensure she was soiled so thoroughly that no one would ever look at her with reverence again. He wanted to break the pedestal he had placed her on. Lucia did not flinch. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale as marble, but she did not step back. She understood now the nature of the trap. It was her body they wanted. It was her physical form that was the battlefield. As long as she was beautiful, as long as she was whole, she was a target. The fiancé's obsession with her eyes, the governor's threat against her chastity, it was all linked. They were trying to own her through her flesh. She was dragged back to the cell while the governor deliberated the logistics of her punishment. The return to the dark was different this time. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving a cold, crystallizing resolve. She sat in the corner of the dripping cell, the sounds of the prison fading into a dull hum. The stone walls were slick with moisture, enclosing her in a silence that forced introspection. In this isolation, the nature of her predicament became terrifyingly clear. She replayed the trial in her mind. Not the words of the governor, but the gaze of the fiancé. She remembered the way he looked at her. It was not the look of a man seeing a woman. It was the look of a miser assessing a hoard of gold. He did not care about her faith, her politics, or her soul. He cared about her face. Specifically, he was enslaved by the aesthetic perfection of her eyes. They were the anchor of his obsession. As long as she retained them, he would pursue her. If she fled to the mountains, he would send trackers. If she hid in the catacombs, he would send dogs. Her beauty was not a gift. It was a beacon that summoned the predator. To escape him, she had to dismantle the very thing he hunted. While historical records speak primarily of the sword, the enduring legend whispers of a darker, more personal sacrifice. Tradition tells us that in the solitude of her cell, she realized her eyes were the chains binding her to his obsession, and she chose to tear away the very thing he desired. Whether she used a shard of pottery or a spindle, the story describes her removing her own eyes, not in a frenzy of madness, but with the terrifying calm of a martyr. Stripped of its golden halo, the legend reveals a harrowing reality. In the silence of the cell, broken only by ragged breathing, she gripped the instrument, perhaps a jagged shard of amphora or a rusted metal spindle found in the dirt. The tip was cold against her skin, but her intent was burning hot. She did not act out of hysteria. This was a calculated, strategic strike against an enemy she could not defeat with swords. She sat on the filth of the dungeon floor and brought the instrument to her face. Her hands trembled, not from hesitation, but from the primal rebellion of the body knowing pain was imminent. History flinches at the details, but the legend persists with terrifying clarity. In the darkness of her cell, Lucia chose to dismantle the very beauty that enslaved her. With a jagged shard and a resolve that transcended human instinct, she severed the chains that bound her to her tormentor. She traded the light of the physical world for an eternal internal darkness, removing her eyes not in madness but in a calculated act of liberation. After the first eye was severed from the optic nerve, leaving her world half dark and screaming in agony, she had to return the blade to the second. The first time, she could only imagine the pain. The second time, she knew exactly what was coming. She knew the sound the tissue made when it parted. She knew the flash of white light that explodes behind the eyelids when the nerve is cut. Blood, thick and warm, would have streamed down her cheeks, mimicking the tears she refused to cry. It ran into her mouth, a metallic taste of her own sacrifice. She was dismantling the masterpiece of her face with the efficiency of a butcher. The sensory deprivation that followed was immediate. The damp walls of the dungeon vanished. The rats in the corner vanished. She was left floating in a red, throbbing void of pain, but in that void, she found a terrifying freedom. She was no longer beautiful. She was a ruin, and a ruin cannot be coveted. She placed them on a piece of rough cloth and handed them to the guard. "Take these to him," she is said to have commanded. "Here is what he wanted. Let him have the rot of the body, but leave my soul to God." The guard, a man paid to inflict violence, would have recoiled. He was used to breaking bones and scourging backs, but this was different. This was an act of holy devastation. This was a prisoner destroying the state's property from within. He took the bundle with shaking hands, the wet warmth of it seeping through the fabric, and hurried away from the darkness of the cell, eager to pass the burden to someone else. The guard, pale and retching, approached the nobleman in the waiting room of the praetorium. The fiancé was likely pacing, his anger slowly cooling into a smug expectation of victory. He believed he had won. He believed the terror of the dungeon would break her, and she would return to him, submissive and grateful. He expected a message of capitulation. When the guard entered, carrying the small, blood-soaked bundle, the fiancé stopped. He likely assumed it was a token of her submission, perhaps a ring or a lock of hair. He reached out, his manicured hands taking the heavy cloth. He felt the dampness. He smelled the coppery tang of fresh blood. He unwrapped the bundle, expecting a final token of surrender. Instead, he was confronted with the gruesome reality of his obsession. There, on the blood-soaked cloth, lay the very eyes he had idolized, now dim, lifeless, and stripped of their light. Without the life force behind them, the eyes were just meat, slippery, bloody, and viscerally repulsive. In that horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. He realized with sickening clarity that he had never loved the woman, only the objectified beauty he wished to possess. He had sought to own the light, but she had handed him the shattered lamp, ruined, dark, and bloody. The betrayal cut deeper than the gore. He had viewed her as property, as a beautiful object to be owned and displayed. By destroying her own value, she had robbed him. It was an act of spite so profound it left him breathless. She had chosen darkness over him. She had chosen mutilation over his touch. The message was clear. She would rather be a blind, disfigured cripple than be his wife. His ego, fragile and inflated, collapsed under the weight of that realization. He dropped the cloth. The eyes rolled onto the marble floor, leaving wet red streaks on the polished stone. He stared at them, the objects of his desire now reduced to garbage, and felt the bile rise in his throat. When the fiancé received this gift, it was not a victory. It was a psychological devastation. He held the object of his desire, now ruined and bloody, and realized he had lost. He could punish her body, but he could never possess her. By plunging herself into darkness, she had placed herself beyond his reach forever. This moment, whether a physical reality or a profound metaphor for her spiritual purity, cemented her legacy as the woman who could not be broken. But the state could not be deterred by self-mutilation. If anything, Pascasius was more furious than before. This act of defiance made him look weak. He had threatened her, and she had raised the stakes. He decided to accelerate the punishment. The brothel threat stood. Blind or seeing, she would be broken. Pascasius was a man who understood power as a physical force. To him, authority was a boot on a neck. Lucia's act of carving out her own eyes was not a spiritual victory in his view. It was a challenge to his control over her biological form. She had damaged state property. He needed to reassert ownership. He needed to prove that her body, damaged or whole, belonged to Rome. The brothel was the perfect mechanism for this. It was not just about sexual violence. It was about the total negation of her autonomy. In the brothel, she would become a public utility, her identity ground down until she was nothing more than flesh for purchase. The soldiers came for her again. This time, they were not just rough, they were tentative. They were touching a woman who had just gouged out her own eyes. There was a superstitious dread in their handling of her. They dragged her from the cell, her blood still wet on her tunic, her face a mask of coagulation and tragedy. They brought her to the entrance of the praetorium, intending to load her onto a cart that would take her to the district of ill repute. The soldiers were accustomed to fear. They were used to prisoners screaming, begging, or fighting back. They were not used to this. Lucia was limp, yet rigid, a paradox of physical surrender and internal iron. The blood from her sockets had begun to dry in dark, crusty streaks down her cheeks, but fresh rivulets still seeped from the trauma, painting her neck in grim patterns. The men avoided looking at her face. The empty sockets were like voids that sucked in the light, reminders of a fanaticism they could not comprehend. To them, she was cursed. Touching her felt like touching an altar dedicated to a dark god. They wanted this job over. They wanted her gone. She cannot see the shame now, Pascasius reasoned, but she will feel it. His logic was cold and bureaucratic. Sight was unnecessary for degradation. The other senses, touch, smell, hearing, would serve as the avenues for her torture. He wanted her to feel the rough hands of strangers, to smell the stale wine and sweat of the lupanar, to hear the jeers of the men waiting in line. He wanted to break her mind by overwhelming her remaining senses with filth. The cart was waiting. The oxen were yoked. The crowds had gathered larger now, drawn by the rumors of the bloody girl. They wanted to see the witch who plucked out her own eyes. 2 soldiers grabbed her arms to hoist her onto the cart. They pulled. She did not move. They frowned, adjusting their grip. They planted their feet and heaved, expecting the light weight of a malnourished, bleeding girl. She remained fixed to the spot. It was subtle at first, just a heaviness, like trying to lift a sleeping person who has become dead weight. But as they pulled harder, the anomaly became impossible to ignore. It was not that she was heavy. It was that she had become part of the geography. It was as if her feet had fused with the basalt paving stones of the street. The soldiers were confused. They knew physics. They knew how much a teenage girl weighed, perhaps 100 pounds, likely less given her fasting. They were men who marched 20 miles a day in full armor. Lifting her should have been effortless. One soldier repositioned his grip, locking his arms around her waist, and jerked upward with a grunt of exertion. Nothing happened. Her sandals remained flush with the stone. Her knees did not bend. Her spine did not flex. She was a statue of lead. Lucia stood there, darkness in her sockets, light in her soul, and the physical laws of the universe began to bend around her. The horror of the eyes was over. The miracle of the mountain was about to begin. The spectacle in the square was devolving into a farce, but a farce underpinned by a creeping, supernatural dread. Two soldiers, men with forearms like knotted ropes, were red-faced and panting, their boots sliding uselessly on the cobblestones. Between them, Lucia stood motionless, her head wrapped in a hastily applied, blood-soaked cloth where her eyes used to be, tilted slightly upward, listening to a voice no one else could hear. To the onlookers, it looked like a magic trick. To Pascasius, watching from the portico, it was an insurrection. "Stop playing games," the governor barked, his voice cracking with frustration. "She is a starving girl, not a statue. Get more men." He refused to accept what he was seeing. There had to be a trick. Perhaps she was hooked to the stones. Perhaps the soldiers were incompetent. He could not allow the crowd to see Roman authority falter against a single blind girl. This was a test of the administration's competence. 4 more guards rushed forward. They were the governor's elite, men who had put down riots and broken shield walls. They surrounded the blind girl, grabbing her by the waist, the shoulders, the arms. On the count of 3, they heaved. By all rights, a frail girl should have been easily lifted and tossed onto the cart. Yet she remained anchored, turning the physics of the Roman Empire into dust. The soldiers strained against a weight that seemed to defy nature itself. It was no longer a matter of muscle. It was a confrontation between earthly force and divine will. The soldiers were not just pulling a girl. They were trying to uproot a mountain. They sweated, their leather armor creaking with the strain, their boots scraping sparks against the road. But Lucia stood in the center of their violence, anchored by a force that made their muscles irrelevant. The murmur of the crowd grew louder. This was uncanny. The Romans were a superstitious people. They knew the difference between stubbornness and sorcery. The fiancé, standing near the governor, was pale. He had wanted her body, but this was a body that refused to obey the laws of nature. He stared at the bandage over her eyes, the dark stains spreading, and then at her feet, which seemed rooted to the earth. The betrayal he had orchestrated was spiraling out of his control. He had tried to use the law to crush her, and now the law was breaking its teeth on her. He had expected her to be dragged away screaming. Instead, she was turning the city square into a stage for her power. Her immobility was aggressive. It was a silent rejection of their entire world. "She is using witchcraft," the fiancé hissed to Pascasius. "She has invoked a demon to hold her fast. Burn her where she stands." Fear made him vicious. He needed a rational explanation for the impossible. Demons were a convenient answer. If she was a witch, she could be destroyed. If she was a saint, he was damned. He preferred the witch narrative. Pascasius ignored him, his mind racing. He could not burn her yet. That would be an admission of defeat. He needed to move her. He needed to prove that Roman authority was absolute. "Bring the ropes," he ordered, "and bring the oxen." It was a grotesque escalation. Teams of oxen, usually reserved for hauling marble columns for the emperor's temples, were brought into the square. Thick, rough hemp ropes were looped around Lucia's small waist and chest, binding her arms to her sides. The other ends were hitched to the wooden yokes of the beasts. The juxtaposition was jarring. Massive, snorting animals, twitching with muscle, tied to a frail, blind, bleeding teenager. The oxen were beasts of burden, bred for torque and endurance. They were engines of flesh designed to move stone and timber. Hitching them to a human being was overkill to the point of absurdity, but Pescasius had abandoned proportion. He needed raw kinetic energy to break the stalemate. The drovers cracked their whips. Crack, crack! The oxen bellowed and lunged forward. The ropes went taut, singing with tension. Dust kicked up in clouds. The wooden yokes creaked, threatening to splinter. The oxen dug their hooves into the cracks of the pavement, straining until foam dripped from their mouths. The animals panicked. They felt the resistance behind them, an immovable anchor that should have been a light drag. They pulled harder, driven by the pain of the whips and the confusion of the task. Their muscles rippled under their hides. The rope stretched, the fibers groaning under the immense load. By all rights, the force should have snapped Lucia's spine or torn her in half. And in the center of the vortex of noise and dust, Lucia stood. The ropes bit into her flesh, squeezing the breath from her, but she did not move. She was the eye of the hurricane. The force being applied should have dismembered a normal person, tearing them apart at the joints. Yet she remained anchored, defying the brute force of nature itself. The connection between the girl and the ground was absolute, as if the earth claimed her before the fire ever could. The ropes vibrated like cello strings, humming with the tension, but the girl at the end of them was as solid as the foundation of the praetorium. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The sheer physics of the event were impossible. A girl against a team of oxen. It was a visual representation of the spiritual against the material, and the material was losing. The oxen slipped, their hooves sparking, unable to gain purchase against the supernatural weight. Pescasius was losing his mind. The crowd was no longer jeering. They were silent, terrified. Some were making signs to ward off evil. Others were whispering that the Christian God was stronger than the Roman oxen. The governor saw his authority evaporating. He had to end this. The logic of the brothel was abandoned. If she wouldn't move to the punishment would be death right here, right now. He could feel the mood of the city shifting. If he didn't kill her, she would become a legend before sunset. The spectacle had backfired. Instead of shaming her, he had given her a platform for a miracle. "Enough!" Pescasius screamed. "Uncouple the beasts. If she loves the earth so much, let her stay there. Bring the oil. Bring the pitch." The soldiers, relieved to be away from the unnatural weight of the girl, scrambled to obey. They piled bundles of dry wood around her feet. They splashed dark, viscous pitch over the wood and over the hem of her dress. The smell of tar mixed with the smell of the oxen and the blood. This was the final solution. Fire, fire, purified. Fire destroyed evidence. Fire did not require leverage or heavy lifting. It was the elemental eraser. The soldiers worked with frantic speed, building a pyre around the living girl. They soaked the wood until it dripped. They wanted an inferno that would consume her instantly, leaving nothing but ash and bone. Lucia stood in the center of the pyre. She could smell the accelerant. She could hear the flint striking steel. She knew what was coming. Fire was the purifier. It was the Roman way of erasing a mistake. She did not struggle. She did not scream. She stood in her darkness, waiting for the heat. The torch was thrown. The fire caught with a whoosh, a wall of orange flame leaping up around her. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. The crowd recoiled. The fiancé turned away, unable to watch the object of his obsession turn to ash. The fire roared, fed by the pitch and the dry timber. It created a vortex of heat that distorted the air in the square. The soldiers stepped back, shielding their faces from the thermal blast. They expected the screams to start immediately. Human flesh burns at a specific temperature, and the pain is absolute. They waited for the thrashing, for the collapse, for the sickening smell of cooking meat. But the screams didn't come. Through the roaring of the flames, a voice was heard. It was chanting, praying. The soldiers squinted through the smoke. The fire was raging, consuming the wood, sending black smoke into the blue Sicilian sky. But where the flames should have been licking at her flesh, they seemed to curve outward. The fire formed a miraculous dome around her, a chaotic halo that refused to touch her skin. She stood untouched in the center of the furnace. The laws of nature had joined the laws of gravity in suspension. The fire burned the wood, it burned the ropes, it burned the stones, but it did not burn the girl. She stood in a pocket of cool air, her lips moving in prayer. The flames danced around her like a protective curtain, refusing to cross the invisible barrier of her faith. To Paschasius, this was the ultimate mockery. Nature itself was rebelling against his edict. Paschasius was trembling. This was impossible. Oxen couldn't move her. Fire couldn't burn her. She had blinded herself, and yet she seemed to see everything. She was dismantling his reality piece by piece. The governor realized that spectacle had failed. Magic or miracle had won the public battle. He needed cold, hard steel. No more games, no more symbolic punishments, just death. He was done with theater. He was done with trying to make a point. He just wanted the biological function of her life to cease. He needed a method that was intimate, brutal, and mechanical. He gestured to a soldier standing near him, a veteran executioner, a man with dead eyes who didn't care about gods or demons. "End it," Paschasius whispered. "Use the sword. Cut her throat. Stop the voice." The order was specific. Stop the voice. Her prayer was the weapon now. It was the sound of her defiance that was driving the crowd to the brink of riot. The soldier nodded. He drew his gladius. The blade was short, broad, and honed to a razor edge. It was a tool for close-quarters butchery. He stepped into the circle of dying embers, the heat still radiating from the stones. He approached Lucia. She couldn't see him coming with her eyes, but she sensed him. She stopped praying. She turned her bandaged face toward him and lifted her chin, exposing her neck. It was an act of final submission, not to Rome, but to the inevitable. She was ready. She offered the target. She cleared the line of sight for the killer. The soldier did not hesitate. He thrust the sword forward with a practiced, brutal efficiency. The blade entered the soft hollow of her throat. It was a vicious, intimate violence. The metal severed the windpipe, the arteries, the cords of her voice. Blood, bright arterial red, sprayed out, soaking the front of her dress, mixing with the soot and the dried blood of her eyes. The mechanics of the wound were catastrophic. The gladius punched through the trachea and the esophagus, nicking the spine. It was a killing blow, delivered with the weight of the empire behind it. The blood pumped out in rhythmic spurts, driven by the frantic beating of her heart. She fell. Finally, she fell. Gravity reclaimed her. The anchor was lifted. She crumpled onto the ash-covered stones, a small broken heap of white cloth and red blood. The crowd let out a collective breath. She was mortal, after all. She bled like anyone else. The fiancé turned away, unable to bear the sight. He had destroyed her body, yet he stood defeated. The girl was gone, but the martyr had just been born. The voice was silenced. The supernatural dread dissipated, replaced by the mundane horror of a murder. The invincible girl was just a corpse. The governor exhaled, his shoulders slumping. He had won, but it felt like a defeat. He had killed the girl, but he had lost the argument. Or so they thought. As the soldier wiped his blade and turned to leave, a sound came from the ground. It was a wet, gurgling sound, but it formed words. Lucia, lying in a pool of her own blood, her throat open to the air, was still speaking. The anatomy of speech had been destroyed. The vocal cords were severed. The windpipe was flooded. Speech should have been physically impossible. Yet the voice came. It was not the clear, bell-like voice of the courtroom. It was a raspy, bubbling sound, forcing its way through the ruin of her throat, but it was intelligible. "I have announced to you the salvation of God," the voice rasped, bubbling through the blood. "Diocletian will fall. Maximian will die. The peace of the church is coming." It was terrifying. A corpse prophesying its own victory. The soldiers backed away. No one wanted to touch her. They let her lie there, bleeding out on the stones of Syracuse. This was political treason, uttered from the grave. She was naming the emperors. She was predicting the collapse of the regime. Even in death, she was striking at the foundations of their power. It was only then, in the strange, suspended moment before death, that a priest stepped out of the crowd. The soldiers, perhaps too stunned to stop him, or perhaps sensing that the governor had lost all stomach for violence, let him pass. He knelt beside her. He produced a small piece of bread, the Eucharist. The scene was surreal. A priest administering the rites to a girl who had been burned, blinded, and stabbed, while the Roman legion looked on in paralysis. Lucia's hand, trembling, reached out. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was there. She received the communion, and only then, after the ritual was complete, after she had finalized her contract with her God, did her body accept permission to die. Her head fell back. The gurgling stopped. The stillness that followed was heavier than the oxen, hotter than the fire. She did not die because of the sword. She died because she was finished. She had completed the transaction. She had outlasted the torture, delivered the message, and received the bread. Now she dismissed her spirit. The fiancé was gone. He had fled into the labyrinth of the city, carrying with him the memory of those empty sockets and the knowledge that his betrayal had created a monster of holiness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ran from the square, but he could not run from the image of the girl who stood against oxen and fire. He had wanted to possess a woman. He had unleashed a saint. The body lay in the square. The sun beat down. The flies began to gather. But the fear in the air was palpable. Syracuse had just witnessed a war between the flesh and the spirit, and although the flesh was dead on the pavement, everyone knew the spirit had won. The immovable object was now a corpse, but the weight of her presence would press down on the city for centuries. The blood on the stones would be washed away by the rains, but the memory of the fire that did not burn would remain. Paschasius returned to his palace. A man diminished. The empire would fall, as she said. The temples would crumble, but the girl would remain. And the eyes? The eyes were gone, lost to the rot, or thrown to the dogs. But in the minds of the people, they were already being restored. They were being placed on that silver platter in the imagination of the faithful, a warning and a promise. You can take the light from the body, but you cannot touch the light of the soul. The immediate aftermath of Lucia's death was not peace. It was a vacuum of stunned silence that the city rushed to fill with whispers. The body was removed by the Christian community to the catacombs, far from the blinding sun. But the horror of her final days did not stay underground. The story of the eyes became the focal point of the legend, a detail too gruesome to be forgotten and too symbolic to be ignored. It resonated with a primal fear, the loss of sight, the vulnerability of the body, and the terrifying agency of a girl who would rather dismantle herself than be owned. Meanwhile, the cult of Lucia grew with a ferocity that matched the violence of her death. Miracles began to be reported, often concerning eyes. the blind came to her tomb, groping their way through the dark tunnels, asking the girl who had given up her sight to restore theirs. It was a paradox that appealed to the desperate logic of faith. She who had plunged herself into darkness was now the keeper of the light. But history moves in strange currents. The Roman Empire, the very beast that had chewed Lucia up, began to die. Just 9 years after Lucia's martyrdom, the tides of history turned. Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legitimizing the very faith that Paisius had tried to drown in blood. But Lucia's legacy would not be confined to the warm stone of Italy. It would find its most enduring home in the cold, traveling north, to a place Lucia had likely never even heard of, Scandinavia. How did a Sicilian martyr become the queen of the Nordic winter? In the frozen winters of Sweden and Norway, where the world is swallowed by a literal crushing darkness, the story of Lucia resonated with a primal force. The Nordic mind merged her with their own folklore of the Lucy night, which under the old calendar was the longest, darkest night of the year. The white robe of the saint covered the ancient fears of the winter dark. This fusion created the tradition we see today, the procession of the Lucia. A young girl, dressed in a white gown with a red sash representing the blood of the wound, wears a crown of burning candles. The imagery is stark. A living girl walks through the dark, fire burning directly on her head, a symbol of peril and purity. It calls back to the fire that refused to burn Lucia in the square. It calls back to the light she carried within when her eyes were gone. The story of Lucia comes full circle. It begins with a man who wanted to possess a girl's beauty and ends with a tradition where that beauty is offered freely to everyone, but only in the form of a spiritual light that cannot be touched or owned. Lucia of Syracuse was never the gentle, passive saint of greeting cards. She was a martyr carved from blood and iron, a figure of uncompromising resolve who refused to be consumed. She is the patron saint of the blind, but essentially, she is the guardian of inner sight. On December 13th, when the candles are lit, we do not just honor a girl who stood in the fire and didn't burn. We remember the woman who plunged herself into darkness so that she could finally, truly see. Lucia's voice was silenced by the sword, yet it echoes through time because we choose to listen. If you value these stories, stories of grit, sacrifice, and truth, you can ensure they continue to be told by joining our community today. St. Lucy, you who found glory in the shadows, pray for us that we may possess the true vision of the soul. Grant us the courage to remain a light in our own darkness, and guide us to see what is eternal. But history holds many more secrets in its silence. Is there another forgotten figure, a misunderstood villain, or a martyr you wish to understand? We are listening. Tell us who we should seek next.